foremost, I'd like to say thank you to the Employment Department for having invited me to take part in this fourth conference. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'd like to thank Sara La Reina, who's organized this section on the post-pandemic challenges, for having thought of me to talk about the demographic transition. As has already been said, I'm an economist at CaixaBank Research. And here, what we look at, what I specialize in, the labor economy, immigration policy, and public policies in general. And a large part of what we analyze today is on inequalities, how to use big data. And as the previous speaker said, it's interesting how all economists now are beginning to use big data, becoming big data scientists. We're at a time of change. And we've seen how the digital transition is going to change how our economies work. We're seeing the green challenge of the ecological transition, which is also going to be important. And the third major trend, which is a structural challenge and which is going to carry on here in upcoming decades, is aging of the population. The majority of you are going to think, oh, goodness me, this is all bad news. So I wanted to change, to put my first picture up that represents what I mean by demographic change. And what I mean by that is that we're going to live longer and we're going to live better. So it's a positive situation. Current and future generations are going to live much better than any past generation. And this is a good news item. But for this to happen as best as possible, we need to analyze the consequences of that and how we can manage it. So, during this presentation, I want you to bear in mind this couple of people that have retired and they're on their bike and they've got better health than their parents or grandparents ever had. Everybody thinks that we're in a time of bad news. No, demographic transition is actually a good piece of news. It's advance in society and health and how we can live longer. And the first news for demographic transition is this increase in life expectancy. And it's all very abstract. Oh, yeah, 30 years, life expectancy will increase by 3 years. But if we reduce that to every day, every person who's born today has 3 hours longer life expectancy than one that was born yesterday. So you can quantify an increase in life expectancy in hours. Every year in Spain, life expectancy increases by 6 hours. If you think about that, that means that problems are around the corner and how we face those problems. If we look at it now, it may well be not so difficult to think, oh no, we need to work more. No, not necessarily. We don't need to necessarily work more. But those 3 hours that we're going to live for longer, maybe we're going to have to spend 30 minutes or an hour more working, but we're going to have another hour, another 30 minutes to spend on leisure. Many of these problems we should put a positive twist on, because as life expectancy increases so much, we're going to be able to spend this time on going on holiday, but also working a little bit more. Another thing related to the demographic perception and also affects the fact that not only do we live longer, but which also is that there's fewer and fewer births. This is a trend that we've been seeing for many decades. In the 1980s, the number of children per women of a fertile age went below the replacement rate of 2.1. By the end of the 1980s, we were actually down to almost 1 child per woman. And the fact that this birth rate's been low for so long means that the population pyramid of new generations is going to be shrinking as well. So we've got a problem here, that's the low birth rate. We can maybe solve it, but until it's solved, and that solution doesn't reach the labour market, a lot of time will go by, many, many years. The third thing when we talk about demographic transition is immigration. Yes, we do live longer, there are fewer births, but we do have migratory flows which to a large extent can solve this reduction in the proportion of people of a working age. This is true in Spain. From the year 2000 onwards, the immigration flows increased quite a lot. In this graph, I use my PowerPoints with lots and lots of graphs, unlike our speaker this morning, but you're going to have to excuse me. That's my way of getting more data to compare what I'm saying with other things. These migratory flows also increase the working age population, but these migratory flows only compensate in the short term because these immigrants also are going to age. So this is the solution, but it's also part of the ingredients that are needed, i.e. immigration is one of the ingredients that's needed. And here I'm going to show you the projections according to the European Commission of immigration flows for 2030 per country as a proportion of the population. As you see in Spain, there will be 0.4% of the population will be immigrants. It's a good figure. It's higher than the average for the Eurozone. And this is going to also create challenges because these continuous immigration flows for many, many years will create problems for integrating these populations, and which is also going to need to be solved. Immigration is an active part of the problem, but it's not the only part of the problem, and nor does it come without additional challenges. So here we've got 20% of the population that are over the age of 65. 60% of the population are of a working age. This is going to change in the next 30 years a great deal. What we're going to see by 2050 is that 1 of every 3 people in the population will be over 65. And only 1 out of every 2 people, that is 51% of the population, will be out of a working age. This aging population is very noticeable, but it's not only very noticeable, but it's very different from one region to the next. This is something that we spoke about earlier, about how these challenges affect differently in each different part of Spain. This is a map of aging ratio, and in Spain and Portugal, in different regions in Spain and Portugal. If you just look at the colours, you can see that over the last 40 years, Spain has aged quite clearly, just looking at the colour blue that's got darker. All regions have aged, but not all at the same rate. The Basque Country is above the Spanish average, it's at 35, but also is Castilla and León, Galicia and Asturias. Some regions are far more aged than others, and this image, apart from just talking about regional differences, and reflect also hides what happens within each region, because in the same region you can have different aging rates if you're talking about rural areas or urban areas. The aging that you get in rural areas is even far more noticeable, because when we talk about longer life expectancy, fewer births, you've got, in addition to that, depopulation or rural exodus from these things. So not everybody's being affected inside the same region in the same way. It's similar to the challenge of the digital challenge, the challenge of the environmental transition. Not everybody is affected in the same way, and this transition is going to be more difficult in some places than other. And the measures to be taken, of course, will be different. The main part of my presentation is a study that we carried out in CaixaBank research on the impact of aging if we just concentrate on economic growth. Normally we talk about health, pensions, but I wanted to talk about the impact of an older society on the economic prosperity of a society. And this we measure by the GDP per capita. If the GDP per capita goes up, then our welfare in society is also increasing. How can age impact economic growth? The first way we see that is if the population ages, then the working population is going down. We're now seeing that the cohorts of a working age are going down, but also because those cohorts that are increasingly older, they have a different way of working. This is the activity rates in different age groups. In relation to the 30 to 34 age group, independently of education levels, the older you get, their activity rates go lower. And from 65 years onwards, they dropped almost half. We're talking about far lower activity rates. That means the more proportion of people we have with larger age cohorts means that we are reducing part of that productivity that could be improving. And this is important. The other side, which is by no means a small thing, but we need to bear in mind when we talk about aging, is that there's changes in productivity. People, throughout their lives, have different skills. On the left, you can see the change in skills used depending on age. The older the worker, the more different the skills are in comparison to the younger workers. It's not saying they've got more or fewer skills, but I'm just saying they're different skills. They read more, they plan more, the older ones, and they've got fewer numerical or technological skills or physical skills. The older a person is, the less their physical activity can be. Maybe we should change the way we perceive this and say that the same person is going to have to change their job because of the change in the way that their skills evolve over age. Those of us that are in the employment service, workers and employers are going to have to think about that, because if we don't think about that, what will happen is that we'll say, okay, older workers are less productive. No, that's simply not true. Have we adapted their skills? This is a social challenge. This isn't something that affects the worker that needs to adapt, or the employer that needs to adapt. No, this is something that we all need to do in society. We are in an aged society, and this aged society is going to need those workers, and maybe they're going to have to work differently. Another important part of this skills change is, of course, technology. Here there are several studies that talk about older people who are less likely to invest because their return is going to be lower, because there'll be less time on the labour market, and they're more reluctant to adopt technological changes. And this may well be true, but we need to pay attention to it. Here I show you on the right the use of BZoom. BZoom is an app that is on your phone. And what we've done is shown how each generation uses BZoom. All generations are increasing their use of BZoom, and during the pandemic, it really increased. What do we see? We see that youngsters use more than 12% of their expenses, what money they spend, and only 12% use the BSIM. So there's a whole generation whom it's going to be far easier to use these technological changes, because it's all part of their DNA and they're already using them. And even though older generations increased in their use, we still see that even at a time of pandemic, when the use of cash was limited or wasn't very recommendable, BSIM use is still fairly small, even though it has increased.
This is going to generate many problems. The fact that each generation has different skills. Let's see the figures. We've analyzed and tried to see what's the impact of aging in economic growth, and trying to separate the part that has to do with the labor market and what has to do with changes in production. The aggregate result is that more aging in Spain, going to the aging in all regions, and in the growth of the GDP per capita with an estimate taking into account different elements. What we do is see that in this decade, an increase of 1% in the aging is going to reduce GDP per capita in a 0.7%. This is going to be similar in 2030, and it's going to reduce in 2040. Aging isn't going to have such an important impact after 2040, because the aging society is so aged that there will be no more great impact. What this means is the higher ratio of aging, then we have less growth of the economy. That's this minus 0.4. We've also broken this down into the number of workers and changes in productivity. What this estimate shows is that half of this impact comes due to changes in the size of the labor force, and the other half comes because of the effect of changes, other kinds of changes. This is what's happened before in Spain between 1980 and 2019. It doesn't mean that it has to continue to be so in future decades, but the aging in Spain has meant less growth because of less productivity and labor force. If we look into the different sectors and analyze the different regions, taking into account the production sectors that are more prevalent, we see an interesting result that has to do with impact being different in those regions where specific sectors are more present. So more aging is going to mean more or less productivity. That's the question. And the answer depends on the sector. In sectors like industry, we observe that more aging is causing an increase in productivity, and this is due to the fact that you can automatize productive processes that increase productivity when you have an aged society. And other sectors like the service sector, at least in the past, it was more difficult for this sector to automatize, and the higher or the greater the aging, there has been a negative impact in productivity. These results will depend on our reaction to aging. And that would be the third element I wanted to highlight here today. What mechanisms can we use to reduce the impact of aging. And here the number of our proposals is broad, but no isolated solution is going to solve the problem. That means we're going to have to apply all of the solutions, and in fact many of them at the same time, for the transition to be the best transition possible. Let's imagine this couple in the motorcycle enjoying their 3 more hours of life. And I also wanted to mention 3 axes. I could go into this further, but first of all, how we contrast this is through demography and immigration and potentiating births to contrast the impact of aging. It is a useful tool that has a long-term impact. So in the next 20 years, this will have an impact, because any child born now won't start working till 20 years or more. With immigration, it's just the opposite, a short-term policy that allows us to reduce the number of people that have a age to work, but we cannot manage this or just allow this with no limits. It has to be managed, and we see in the news how fragile irregular immigration is and how having this regulated flows of immigrants is so important, and it's a complex issue. The labor market. What can I say about this in a forum such as this one? The labor market is going to be key to palliate the effect of aging. Having more occupation is good per se, but also having an increasing population that will improve the employability of workers. Sara de la Rica has already mentioned how for certain groups of people that are older, they stay unemployed for longer periods of time. So how can we allow this when we know we have an aged population? We need to improve their employability, not only for the youth, but also for those all ages would be a key element. It will be key for the economic impact of aging that I mentioned before, and also for many other things, but specifically for this purpose. And we could also talk about the pension system here. If life expectancy is increasing 3 hours per day, maybe it will also be normal for the retirement age to increase 1 hour per day. So automatically we should have a rule that says if it increases 3 hours, then you have to work 1 more hour. And if this is explained to workers in these terms, it will be easier to understand why we have to extend the years of work, because we're going to be retired much longer than previous generations. And here I have another comment regarding the retirement system. It has to be flexible. It can go from 0 to 100, from not working to working. It should be a more flexible system that allows you to reduce the number of hours and change the skills for the job position. And this will allow us to coexist in an aged society without it having such an impact on economic growth. Education and training is the third pillar that also brings us to the green and transition challenges. We need to have education from early ages that is focused on technological skills, but also non-cognitive skills, because personal relationships continue to be really significant. So we need to change our mindset, not only learning specific knowledge to learning that what we are learning right now is not what we will need in the future. So we will have to learn new things and new skills and have an ongoing learning process. And here I hope I didn't go too fast in this last part, and thanks for your attention.